Okay, so just to be clear from the outset, I am never going to say that there are no differences between the way that men and women behave, think, and see the world in all sorts of contexts. But I will argue the point with anyone that the focus on a single category of distinction as a way to determine pretty much everything that humans do, from shopping behaviour to intuition to pay rates, as well as a means of discrimination, is just wrong and not supported by evidence. And while there are differences between men and women, the distinction between whether these differences represent the way that men and women essentially are, as opposed to how we think men and women are or should be, is a really important one. In fact, there's consistent evidence from research including meta-analyses on gender differences that shows that, except for a few key exceptions, men and women are actually more the same than they are different. But like all things in life, if we're looking for something, including differences, then we're more likely to find them. Think of it this way: even when women and men do or think the same thing or have similar ambitions, the way that we expect them to be will still influence how we see them. In other words, gender stereotypes and how we expect genders to behave and think are likely to lead people to see and treat men and women differently, even if they're doing or thinking the same thing. Your maleness or your femaleness is one of the first social categories we learn to apply. Even before you're born, your gender is imposed on you, perhaps unconsciously. When somebody asks an expectant parent what she or he is hoping for, most people will say unconsciously, without thinking, a boy or a girl. Not a human baby, or maybe a dichotomous category like blue or green eyes. Even seemingly innocuous things like gender reveal parties, which happen before the kid is born, for goodness sake, reinforce our need to separate the girls from the boys. And no matter how hard some parents might try to bring up their kids in a gender-neutral way, it's virtually impossible. From the moment that you're conceived, the social world around you happily sorts pretty much your whole life into the binary, even if you don't want it to. So many unconscious, unnoticeable factors go into the brain-building cycle of children and some adults. Things like social norms, access to media stereotypes, advertising, and the modelling of parent behaviour, of friends, and even innocuous things like social interactions. And what happens is that both conscious and unconscious imprinting of different expectations drives boys and girls toward different trajectories in relation to socialisation, career and success, as well as things like self-confidence and risk-taking. And then there's people who argue that biology or evolution prove the difference between males and females. So things like the physical strength of men on average, or different levels of testosterone or oxytocin in men and women. But they're actually wrong because it doesn't reflect our current knowledge. Actual scientific research, rather than books based on anecdote that are written to reinforce your current beliefs and sell lots of copies, suggests that the division of gender roles in hunter-gatherer societies is much more egalitarian than most people often assume, and that the evidence in relation to things like specific hormones and their effect on behaviour is not as definitive as you might think. So, for example, while testosterone has been shown to be a precursor of aggressive behaviour, it can also influence prosocial behaviour and care. Another example often used to demonstrate these immutable biological differences is in relation to the social bonding hormone oxytocin. Now, oxytocin is often attributed to women's roles as carers, but in fact, research shows that men and women show equal levels of increases in the hormone 6 months after the birth of their first child. And it should really go without saying that your genitals are not antecedents to your beliefs, your values, or whether you like shopping, guns, or racing cars. There's also no evidence that men's and women's brains are wired differently, which seems to come up a lot in popular reporting. One of these brain wired differently arguments goes that women are not really less intelligent than men, just different in how they think and work. And funnily enough, in a way that reinforces the status quo of gender roles. So the argument goes that women's brains are wired for empathy and intuition, while male brains are best at reason and action. But again, there's just no evidence to support this. Things like language processing is not spread any more evenly across women's hemispheres than it is in men's. And that oldie but a baddie that men's brains are bigger than women's is also not particularly well supported. Research shows that brain size increases with body size. And even if there is a small difference in brain size between men and women, it has no relationship to, I don't know, somebody's hobbies, their desire to go shopping, or their take-home pay. Research also shows that men and women's cognitive performance in areas like maths, their personality or their social behaviours, and even their psychological well-being is more similar than different. And success in any of these fields is more likely to be an outcome of external forces like conditioning, reward, power imbalance, social modelling, and reinforcement. But the most important thing that comes up most often in nearly all of these studies is that men and women show more significant differences among individuals, whether male or female, than between males and females as collective groups. What's happening is that we're so tuned in for looking for differences between men and women, we don't notice the similarities. And the fact that we have established different societal roles and assumed positions of power for men and women has meant that we're more likely to emphasise and enlarge real differences. In other words, we find what we're looking for. Like I said at the beginning of this fairly long piece, of course there are differences between men and women, but sometimes our focus on this single attribute as a means of discrimination is just not useful. Humans are complex and nuanced, and to think that 51% of the population would all think, behave and be the same is just ridiculous. Yet we persist with the simplistic notion of the exclusive differences between these two groups. And because of this, these two groups are forced to conform to these simple distinctions. But in reality, wouldn't life be easier and better if we simply opened our minds a bit and embraced, I don't know, the brilliance of difference?